This is Hypnotic Stories, Episode 9, titled Stories for Smoking Cessation.
Hypnotic Stories is your treasure trove of hypnotic storytelling for change work and self-improvement. Here is your host, Master Storyteller James Hazlerig.
Well, hello, all you spellbinding storytellers. Today is an episode I've been thinking about for a while, where we're going to talk about the metaphors and reframes that I use in smoking cessation. Now, there are some things I'm going to do with pretty much every smoking client, and some I'm only going to do with one or two. One of those things, though, that I'm pretty definitely going to do as they walk through, is I say, hey, how are you doing? And usually they say, I'm a little anxious, a little uncertain about all of this. And I'll often say, are you anxious or are you excited? Instantly, I start reframing how they are approaching this. And I find that's one of the most important things I have to do, because so many people, they have the frame that they're about to give up something that they love. My job really is to reframe it into stepping into a new self, shedding the old skin, becoming a better, newer version of themselves. So the way that I do this is with a blend of waking hypnosis, right? Storytelling. I also use education, teaching them about some of the chemicals and drugs involved in smoking. I even reframe the idea of addiction. And of course I do a lot of conventional hypnosis, which depending on the client might involve a 2 doors process where they experience life if they don't quit smoking and the life they get when they do. Sometimes there's some parts work. There's definitely always future pacing, direct and indirect suggestion. Sometimes there's some mapping across. Sometimes there's some swish pattern. Sometimes there's pain as object, that type of thing. Now, I don't use every technique with every client, and I don't tell every story in my repertoire to every client. I'm going to pick and choose the ones that are most effective for the client sitting in front of me. Now, sometimes I put all these stories together into nested loops. Sometimes I don't. Sometimes I just tell an individual story. I pretty much always am going to reference these stories later on in the session, whether it's when their eyes are open or their eyes are closed. So these things become a theme, and that's what allows my clients to walk out of the office as non-smokers. So I hope you enjoy this collection of stories. A little bit longer than my usual podcast, but hey, you're worth it. This morning, I had a client come into my office, and she was scheduled for her 3rd optional session in what I call the smoking emancipation program. And now most of my clients come in for their 1 session, and then we do a brief follow-up 2 days later, and they have no problem remaining the rest of their lives as non-smokers. However, I do offer what I call a safety net or a tune-up, a booster that is included in the program, and at any point in the next year, my client can come back in case they feel like they need it, or if they just want to come back and see me for some other reason. I even had one guy who said, I need my emergency session, and I got him in as fast as possible, and then found out he hadn't smoked. He hadn't even wanted a cigarette. They disgusted him. He just remembered how great hypnosis made him feel, and so that's why he wanted to come back in for another session. I was happy to do that. Now, this morning, that was not the case. This client had called and told me, and they usually have a little bit of trepidation, a little embarrassment about this, that she had started smoking again. She'd had a really tough, stressful experience, and she didn't do all the things she knew were good to take care of herself, but that she was getting back on the horse and she was going to do it right this time, and that things were different. So as I was getting ready to see her, looking over her intake, I started thinking about some of the stories that I like to tell my clients and some of the ways that we think about smoking cessation. And, while cessation is the big fancy word that we use, I like to think of it, as I said earlier, as a smoking emancipation. Because really, smoking is metaphorically a form of slavery. Cigarettes make people weak, sick, and helpless. And while I recognize that it's not the same as actual historical slavery was, I do like to use that metaphor. And so I'll often talk about, when the Emancipation Proclamation came down and people in the South were told that they were now free, people had different reactions. And some of them, upon hearing it, said, oh, wow, I can't handle anything other than the life that I've known so far. I'm fairly comfortable with my shackles. I'm just going to stay here. I can't imagine any other life. And while they were technically free, they essentially, I'm sad to say, remained slaves the rest of their lives. Now, many others, upon hearing it, said, yes, this is what I have wanted this whole time. And they walked right up to the edge of the plantation property, and they got right to the edge and stopped and couldn't step over, and eventually hung their heads low and went back. There are some who went right up to the edge and then they stepped over it, and they felt fantastic, and they felt this rush of adrenaline, of excitement and anxiety all together, but with each step they took, it got a little bit worse, and then they had to go back. Some of them got right up to the edge, they walked over, and they looked around. They looked for the men, the dogs. Nobody was chasing them. They made it a little ways, then walked back across the line, but then pushed. And they walked back and forth over that line a couple of times until finally they reached escape velocity and kept going. And there are others who walked right up to it, crossed that line, and never looked back, kept walking till they made it to the north. And that's kind of how it is for a lot of people who are quitting smoking. Some go back and forth across that line. Now, there was a letter written by one of these slaves who had managed to become free. His name was Jordan Anderson, and he gained his freedom in 1864. And on August 7th, 1865, he dictated a letter back to his old master. And this was in response to a letter that had been sent to him. He was at that point living in Ohio, had his own farm. His family was there, his wife, his daughters. And just to summarize, basically, the letter he'd received said, hey, Jordan, I never really appreciated how hard you worked on the tobacco plantation, but now that you're not here, really everything is just falling apart. We can't get the tobacco crop in. Things are going poorly. And I'd really like to hire you to come back and work here so that we can do well. Oh, and by the way, so-and-so, so-and-so, and so-and-so, all your old friends, they miss you and they wish you would come back. So they're really hoping that you'll do this, not just for my sake, but for them, just to come on back and do what you used to do when you were a slave. Well, Mr. Jordan Anderson dictated a letter back, and to paraphrase, he essentially said, well, thank you. Say hi to all of those people that I miss and tell them that I love them. And I want to thank you for recognizing that all this time you should have been paying me. And in fact, if you'd like me to come back, you can begin with a gesture of goodwill by paying me all the money that you owe me for the many years that I worked for you. I think he had been a slave for 34, 39 years, something like that. And he estimated it was over $11,000, which in 1865 money is an enormous sum. But he went on to say, now, of course, I'm not going to leave my wife alone here in Ohio, so you're going to have to employ her, and you're going to have to pay her for all of her back payment for the labor that she did. And he included how much that would be. And he said, and my daughters, really, they were robbed of their childhood because they were forced to go out there and pick tobacco. And Also, they suffered many other indignities, which I will not mention, but for which you need to get down on bended knee and give them a profound apology. The letter is a brilliant, brilliant piece of work. It really just solidifies what a free person is. And, thinking about freedom, I was reminded that this client who was going to be coming in her intake, she had mentioned being, our technical polite term for it is woo-woo. She was a little bit into shamanism and mysticism and other things of that nature. And it happens that I have at least one foot in that world. And I was reminded of how in the tarot, that's the deck of cards used by many fortune tellers, there's a card in it that is called the Devil card. And in the traditional form of the Devil card, the devil, with the horns and the wings and all of that stuff, is sitting on a throne, and chained to his throne with big collars around their necks are a man and a woman. Now, one of my favorite tarot decks, though, had a different interpretation of that. The devil in its classic form doesn't appear at all in that particular card in this deck that I love. It's the Robin Wood deck, by the way. Instead, the illustration shows a treasure chest, and there are chains attached to it, and a man and a woman are both pulling on the chains. And I love that because it shows that they're not enslaved to the devil or enslaved to this thing that they think is so important that's holding them back. They could let go at any time as long as they can let go. And it really reminds me of something that the author Robert Heinlein said, which is that, and I'll paraphrase again, he said, "No one can free a slave. A slave can only free himself." And so that's why I really set that challenge to my clients. Are they ready to free themselves with my guidance? And thinking about all of that, I thought that perhaps a reference to the Devil card and that idea would be useful with this client I had coming in. And I was reminded of how in her first session, I told a story that I tell quite a few of my clients, actually, because many of them I ask, have you had your last cigarette? And they almost always assure me that they have. And I always ask, did you enjoy it? And in fact, I'll skip ahead and tell you that when this lady came in for me to work with her, she told me that the last two, she just had to force herself to smoke them. She really couldn't even stand them. And that reminds me of a time that I was on the road with the guitar player that plays in my band. We're a duo, really. And we were traveling around playing gigs. And one day we were in my truck and we stopped at a gas station convenience store, and he'd been driving, so it was my turn to pump the gas and get ready to take the next shift driving. So while I was pumping the gas, he went into the convenience store, and when he came out and got into the passenger seat, he had one of those ice cream sandwiches, the kind with the cheap vanilla ice cream in it and the kind of sticky chocolate wafer. And they tend to be kind of messy, but he was very careful, and I appreciate that in my truck, that he was very fastidious and took the wrapper off carefully and used it to shelter his hands. And then when he was done, licked his fingers and wiped them off and cleaned up everything very nicely and threw away the wrapper so it didn't make a mess. And we drove in silence the whole time, and in fact in silence a little ways after that. When you've known someone that long, it's not too hard to do. But finally, just to make some conversation, I said, "So, did you enjoy your ice cream sandwich?" Now, the guy who plays music with me is a very literal guy. And he paused for a moment and he thought about it. And then he said, "No, I really didn't enjoy that ice cream sandwich." And I said, "Now that's weird. I've seen you eat other ice cream sandwiches. did you enjoy those? And he says, well, no, not really. And I said, well, was there anything wrong with this one? He says, no, it was fine. It was like all the others. And I don't think I've enjoyed one in years. And I said, well, why do you buy them? He said, well, when I see it in the store, the thought pops into my head that I'll enjoy it. And I said, well, where'd that thought come from? And again, he paused and he said, when I was 10 years old, they were pretty good. I think I enjoyed them when I was 10, but by the time I was 11 or 12, I really didn't enjoy them. I just ate them out of habit. I said, wow, so that thought that pops into your head is actually a lie. He said, yeah, that's true. Now, look, I did not hypnotize him to stop eating ice cream sandwiches. I don't care whether or not he eats ice cream sandwiches as long as he doesn't make a mess in my truck. But I did notice near the end of the tour that he hadn't bought any more. And I asked him what was going on with that. And he said, well, I still see him in the store. I still have the thought. But I know the thought is a lie. And I know I don't enjoy it. And in fact, I then say, okay, what will I actually enjoy? And I go get that instead. And I reflected on how sometimes those thoughts that we have, it's kind of like in my youth, I had a cassette player. And it was part of a boombox, so there was a radio and a cassette player, and you could tape songs off the radio. And, back then we didn't have an internet and MP3s and downloads and all that great stuff. So I would listen to the radio, and if there was a song I liked, I would tape it onto a cassette. Now, eventually, my cassette got full, and being a kid who was kind of cheap, I didn't, just go buy other cassettes. I would start taping over with new songs, the ones that I didn't like. But I noticed that if you listened really carefully, you could hear, especially in between songs, the echo of the old recording that no longer applied. But I also knew that if you focused on the new recording, you didn't notice the old one at all. And sometimes those old thoughts are kind of like that. In fact, sometimes those old thoughts can be kind of thrilling. And I noticed that a few months ago because I realized it was time to retire the old truck. That truck was great when I was traveling around the country, and it was two of us, and we had a guitar and two fiddles and a mandola and a PA system and a bunch of CDs and all of that stuff we had to carry. But now I'm mostly driving my hour and 15 commute each way from my home to my office, and at most I have to carry a few minor items back and forth. So the truck is retired, and I bought a Prius. And man, it is pretty cool. A 2013, the truck was a 2003, and technology has changed. And the Prius has this cool thing called keyless entry. So when I walk up to the Prius, if the key fob is in my pocket, there's not even a key per se, the key fob is in my pocket, and I reach over to open the door, it opens right up, and I sit down inside, and I don't even have to put the key in it as long as the key fob is somewhere there in the car. The car knows. It's amazing. And I just put my foot on the brake and hit the start button, and boom, it starts up. It's like a spaceship. It's so cool. But it took me months after buying it to stop reaching into my pocket to pull out my keys as I was walking up to it. And at first, I would reach in, and it was slightly annoying and be like, yeah. But pretty soon, every time I did it, I just got a smile because I'd think, wow, I don't have to do that anymore. I am freed from this old limitation that was a part of my old life. And now I can do better, more interesting things. And so I knew I could just smile and think, I don't have to do that anymore. Anytime I went through that habitual action that no longer applies. And, of course, I have often told that story to my new ex-smokers, my people who are being emancipated, so that they can recognize that the same applies if they reach for their cigarettes or if they reach for the lighter, that they don't have to do that anymore. So thinking about what approach I was going to take with this client who was coming in, I remembered how usually what I do is I wait and listen to my clients, and I find out what it is that's important to them. And I find that the client hands me the right verbiage, hands me the right metaphor and the right approaches to use. I remember one client I had, he was what we call in Texas a good old boy. And I asked him, so what do you like to do to enjoy yourself? And he said, I love going down to Galveston, getting on my boat and getting out on the water and fishing. And I said, wow, that's great. I bet you take really great care of your boat, don't you? And he said, oh, I do. It's completely shipshape. And so we talked quite a bit in his hypnosis session about how to keep a boat or a body shipshape. And he realized that he could take just as good care of himself as he could his boat. And that became the metaphor for him becoming free from cigarettes. And, there was another fellow who, again, kind of a good old boy. We have a lot of those in Texas. He came in and told me that one of the challenges in quitting smoking was he had a lot of stress in his life. Now, a little bit later, I was going to be explaining that cigarettes actually exacerbate stress, but for the moment, I just asked him to tell me about that. He said, well, I inherited a sawmill from my father. And my kid brother, now, mind you, this guy is, in his late 50s, so his kid brother is probably in his early 50s. But still, he says, my kid brother keeps butting in. He thinks it got left to both of us, and he thinks that he should be in charge of things. And he keeps coming up with dumb ideas of things he wants to do in the sawmill, and he doesn't seem to understand that we have some really high-quality, expensive equipment that is dangerous if it's not maintained properly and used properly. I mean, people could get hurt. They could lose limbs. They could die. And yet my stupid kid brother keeps coming up with dumb ideas. I said, wow, what do you do when your kid brother comes up with these dumb ideas? And he said, I just ignore him. I tune him out. He's just like a annoying mosquito, and I just do my best to ignore him and go on and do the best thing for the sawmill. And I said, wow, man, that must be frustrating. He says, yeah, that guy, he sounds like a 12-year-old kid with the ideas he comes up with. And I said, wow, that's amazing. So when did you start smoking? And he said, well, I was 12 years old. And right then I saw my metaphor, and I said, so you can ignore the stupid ideas of a 12-year-old even when they come out of a grown man. And he said, yeah. And I said, especially when you're dealing with a piece of complex machinery that you have to maintain well, that you have to take care of, or people could get hurt. People could lose limbs. People could die if you don't maintain this piece of equipment properly. He said, yeah, that's true. And I said, but if you don't take care of it properly, a lot of times there's some way that you'll know, won't you? And he says, yeah, generally it'll start smoking really badly if it's in danger. And I said, so smoke is a good sign that something's wrong and you need to do something to eliminate that smoking, don't you? And he looked at me and his eyes got wide, and he looked like he'd been trapped. So I knew that as my client got there, all I was really going to have to do was talk to her and listen, and I would find out what the right approach was. So she came in, and she told me that things went really well. After our session, she had zero desire to smoke cigarettes and did very well, although she had to admit that she felt like in the first session she had never totally stepped in to being a non-smoker. So I asked her what was different this time, and she said, I'm so ready. I'm just so ready. I feel like I'm starting a new chapter in my life. And I don't know exactly what it'll be, but I know that smoking is not a part of it. And so I said, a couple of things come up as I'm hearing you talk about your experiences. The first, you mentioned that your husband was supposed to go in for a minor outpatient surgery, and he ended up having to spend 6 weeks in the hospital. And during that time, you tell me that you quit doing the things that you know are good for you. You quit meditating, you quit eating right, you quit exercising, you quit using the essential oils that you love to use. And she nodded her head and said, yeah, I know. And I said, sometimes I like to imagine that we have an immune system that works not just physically for our body, but that we have a metaphorical one that works for our mind and our emotions. And that when it gets run down, we get emotionally sick. And a lot of that is fading back into old patterns. And so, for instance, if I don't take good care of my emotional, spiritual immune system, which means doing all the same things that boost my physical immune system too, I find that I slip back into patterns of depression and anxiety. And so when that happens, I stop and I remind myself, hey, what do I need to do to take good care of myself? Because, when I know something stressful or challenging is coming up, I have to think about it like an Olympian thinks of the Olympics. I need to train for it and prepare for it by taking the best care of myself that I can. And she nodded and she said, yeah, this kind of caught me unawares. I said, yeah, I know. So just forgive yourself for that. It's okay. And she looked grateful for that. And then I said, the other thing that comes up is I'm kind of reminded of my former fiancé. Now, before I go into what I told her about my former fiancé, let me say that with a number of clients, I use the metaphor of the skanky ex. And it might be a skanky ex-girlfriend or a skanky ex-boyfriend. But I always look at them, especially if they mention challenges with alcohol. And I say, so you probably had that friend who dated someone who was totally wrong for them. And everyone nods. Everyone has had that friend. I even say, I hope you weren't that friend. And a few of them look a little chagrined in that moment. And I say, you saw your friend with that skanky ex. And let's assume for a moment the client's male. And I'd say, and you would just shake your head thinking, what does he see in her? She is so tacky, so terrible. I don't even like who he is when she is around. But, your friend was so into her, so crazy about her. And then, of course, she would do something that breaks his heart for a little while. They would break up and he would cry on your shoulder and you'd think, oh, thank God they broke up. But then a few days later, they'd be back together and you would think, why can't he see what's going on here? But it's just like she knew how to push all of his buttons. And finally, at one point, he comes to you and he's just furious. He's like, I am done. I am so done with her. It's never going to happen again. I'm never going back to her. And you are relieved once more. And you're like, hey, let's go out and get some drinks. Let's celebrate. So you and your friend are down at the bar. You're having a great time. You're celebrating and it's wonderful. He's had a few and she shows up. The skanky ex shows up, and before you know it, she's pushed his buttons. They're making out in the corner. But the next morning, he wakes up, and he's got that coyote ugly moment. He is ready to gnaw his leg off to get out of the trap because he has realized what's happened. And, I bet your friend eventually got to a point where he realized there's not enough booze in the world. There's not enough alcohol in the world to make you go back to that disgusting, terrible thing that made you into a person you didn't even like being. And the fact is, there's not enough booze in the world to make you go back to being a smoker. And if you happen to go out and have a few drinks, now I always ask my clients to abstain for about 2 weeks. But I say, even if you went out and had a few drinks, you would become, as many people drinking do, more and more adamant of your convictions about who you are. And so if somebody offered you a cigarette, you would, just like your friend might to that skanky ex, say, there is no way I'm ever going back to you. Screw you, we are done. And that's how determined you can be about it. Now, in the case of the client who came in this morning, alcohol was not an issue, and it really wasn't like that, but instead I told her about my former fiance. Now, I will not say that she was skanky, but we had some issues. At first, when I fell in love with her harder, really, than I ever fell for anybody. Looking back, I really don't like who I became when we were together. In fact, she often made me feel kind of weak, sick, and helpless, and I don't like being that kind of person. And we had, some ups and downs, but things seemed to be sort of going along okay until one day I actually was literally sick. I had the flu, and so I was sleeping in the bed in the afternoon, and I woke up in the afternoon and I needed to use the restroom, and I got up to go to the restroom, which took me past the living room where she and an old friend of mine who was a house guest at that time were completely naked on the couch making the beast with two backs. I blew up and threw her out right there, swore I never wanted to see her again. But, she came back around. She was so apologetic. We tried for, the better part of a year. Maybe it wasn't that great a part of a year, but anyway, we tried to get it back together, and we tried to make it work, and we even had a few, moments where things seemed kind of nice, but ultimately I reached a point where I realized I was just done, totally done with her. And there was no way I would ever go back. And my client looked at me and she said, that is exactly how I feel. That's exactly how I felt last night when I smoked that last cigarette. I just realized I was done, and I just feel like it's time to be free. And I said, a good friend of mine recently asked me and my wife if we would help her out with a kind of a ceremony, a ritual, on the 1-year anniversary of her divorce, because she wanted to cut the cords. In fact, she had literal hand fasting cords from a pagan wedding, and she'd been hanging on to them all this time, even though she was way, way done with that marriage. And so we literally helped her cut those cords. And my client just smiled at me and she said, that is so weird. I was thinking about cord cutting last night. Now I just want to cut all ties with tobacco, and I'm done with it. And then she said something very interesting. She said, I even had a conversation with Mama Tobacco. Okay, I've never heard this one before, but that's okay. And she said, and I thanked her for the lessons she taught me, and I said, I'm done. And I said, every daughter reaches a point where she realizes she is taller than her mother. And every child, I think, in order to become an adult, reaches a point where they strike out on their own and they realize, my parents might have been the bow, but I am the arrow, and I choose my path. The client just smiled. Of course, we went on to do some other hypnosis. I guided her through some great stress relief techniques and reminded her of things she would need to do, and gave her plenty of suggestions about having zero desire whatsoever, because, look, I'm a storyteller, but I'm also a hypnotist. But at one point, I began to talk to her about monarch butterflies, because a monarch butterfly, like her, goes through a big transition where they step into a new chapter of their life. And, the fascinating thing to me is that when a monarch is a caterpillar, it eats a particular plant called milkweed. And milkweed is poisonous to birds. It's not harmful to monarch caterpillars, but it is poisonous to birds. And so birds leave the monarch alone. Now, at some point, it's time for the monarch to make its transition. And it spins its cocoon, it goes into the chrysalis, and it transforms. And, most of us, when we were in preschool or kindergarten, or at some point, were in a class where they had, some cocoons, and we got to see the transformation. It was so cool. And many of us noted that when that monarch first comes out, its wings are kind of wet. It takes a little bit to spread them and finally be able to fly at a height greater than the caterpillar could ever reach. And yet what's amazing is that milkweed that the caterpillar ate to make itself toxic carries on into the adult butterfly. Now, adult monarch butterflies never eat milkweed, but they have that lesson they learned, that thing they took on in an earlier part of their life that makes them stronger and keeps them safe. Even though they don't need to do that thing they once did anymore. And, it's also fascinating to know that if you were to go take a chrysalis halfway through the transformation and dissect it, cut it open. Now, I would never do this, but people have done it. You'd think you would find this thing that was half caterpillar, half butterfly, little stunted wings growing, perhaps. But no. You find a kind of primordial goo. This thing that is neither one nor the other, but holds the benefit and the potential of transformation within it. And so I went on and I riffed on this idea for a while in her session. And I did some other things I always do. But in the end, I thought it was wonderful that she had brought with her the seeds of her own transformation. And it reminded me of the motto of my business, which in Latin is Miracles venio hic. Now, I translated that from the idea that miracles happen here. But I found out later another way that could be translated is miracles come here. And I think every client who walks through my door is a miracle waiting to happen, carrying the seeds, the metaphors for us to use to help them. Well, storytellers, I hope that you enjoyed those metaphors for smoking cessation, and I hope that's inspired you to come up with some of your own. Feel free to steal the ones that I've presented here. I want to mention a few things that are coming up in my future as a storyteller, and a few recent developments. For one thing, I've started a Facebook group for people who love hypnotic storytelling and want to talk about this podcast and other things related to it. It's called the Order of Spellbinding Storytellers because, if we're going to have a group, we might as well have a fun name, right? There might even be special rings or something. I don't know. Anyway, you can join that on Facebook. Just go to facebook.com/groups/spellbinding storytellers, all in one word. There's another group, by the way, on Facebook that I'm finding to be a lot of fun and want to tell you about. It's actually hosted by Nick Kemp and Doug O'Brien, and those of you who are into neurolinguistic programming will know those names. They're both well-known as storytellers as well as NLP instructors. And their group is called Original 2-Minute Stories, and they're inviting people to present original 2-minute stories of 2 minutes or less. So you can go there, you can record your own, upload it to the group. You can also just enjoy lots of really interesting, inventive things that people have done in 2 minutes or less. and that is at facebook.com/groups/2, that's the numeral 2, Minute Stories, all one word. Now, there are some fun things that are coming up for me right now. I'm recording this in September 2017, so in October 2017, I'll be presenting on storytelling and on Laughnosis at the Mid-America Hypnosis Conference. I hope that you will run right out and join me there in Chicago. It's going to be a lot of fun, a really great time. I also want to mention that I've been lining up some excellent guest storytellers for the podcast. In fact, just the other day, I got to interview Mercedes Herman, who is truly a delightful person. There are also going to be some mailbag segments where I'll answer a few questions that people have sent to me. If you have a question about hypnotic storytelling that you would like answered, please send it to me, and you might very well get featured here in the podcast. In the meantime, just keep telling amazing stories.
Thanks for listening to the Hypnotic Stories Podcast with James Hazlerig. If you've enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with your friends. For free storytelling tips, go to www.hypnotic-stories.com.